The watchtower smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Werner Kast stood at the observation slit, his gloved hands resting on the rough wooden frame, his eyes moving slowly across the tree line 300 meters away. The forest of Belarus stretched endlessly before him, dark and still in the gray morning light of late May 1944. Spruce trees rose like silent sentinels against a pale sky. Somewhere behind that wall of timber and shadow, the world continued its war. But here, at this particular moment, there was nothing. Only stillness. Only the low sound of wind moving through branches. He had learned over 3 years of fighting on the Eastern Front to read silence the way a farmer reads weather. Some silences meant rest, some meant preparation, and some the rarest kind. The kind that settled into your bones like cold water, meant something was wrong in a way you couldn't yet name. Werner Kast was 44 years old. His face carried the particular weathering of a man who had spent winters in the open field, who had survived artillery barrages by throwing himself into frozen mud, who had watched friends die in ways that no training manual had ever prepared him for. The lines around his eyes were deep. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly gray at the temples. He wore the rank of lieutenant colonel, but the rank meant less to him now than it once had. What mattered in this war, what had always mattered, was the ground beneath your feet and the men standing beside you. He had been in Russia since the summer of 1941. He had crossed the Soviet border in the first wave of Operation Barbarossa, riding in the back of a truck with 100 other young officers who believed, genuinely believed, that the campaign would be finished before winter. They had laughed about it. They had made bets. Some of them had written letters home promising they would be back for Christmas. None of them had imagined this. None of them had imagined 3 years. Werner lowered his binoculars and turned away from the slit. The watchtower creaked beneath him as he descended the ladder, his boots finding each rung with the mechanical precision of long habit. Below, the trench network of his sector spread out in both directions, reinforced with timber and sandbags, connected by narrow communication passages that smelled of wet clay and old smoke. Men moved along the bottom of the trenches in the early morning routine, checking ammunition, on brewing whatever passed for coffee in the third year of a losing logistics chain, writing letters that might not arrive for weeks. His battalion held a 4-kilometer section of the German defensive line west of Vitebsk. It was not the most important sector. It was not the most dangerous. But it was his, and he knew every meter of it the way a man knows his own house in the dark. The position was formidable, at least on paper. Concrete bunkers had been embedded into the earthworks at regular intervals, each one housing a machine gun crew with overlapping fields of fire. Minefields had been laid in 3 concentric belts across the approaches. Anti-tank guns were positioned in camouflage pits, angled to cover the most likely Soviet approach routes. Behind the main line, Nari's second position had been prepared for fallback if the front line was penetrated. And behind that, the city of Vitebsk itself, which German High Command had officially designated a Fester Platz, a fortified place, meaning it was to be held to the last man under any circumstances, regardless of what happened on the flanks. Werner had received that designation order in March. He had read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the wooden box where he kept his personal documents. He had not discussed it with his officers. There was nothing useful to say about an order that translated, in practical terms, to a death sentence dressed in military language. He walked the trench line in the early morning, as he did every day, stopping to speak briefly with the men at their posts. He knew most of them by name, and he knew which ones had families waiting at home, which ones had been on the front long enough to lose the ability to imagine anything beyond the next meal and the next watch shift. He knew which ones were afraid and which ones had passed through fear into a kind of hollow steadiness that was, in its own way, more troubling than fear. Private Heinrich Brauer, 20 years old from somewhere in Saxony, who still wrote to his mother every week, was cleaning his rifle at the base of the trench when Werner passed. "Quiet night, sir," the young man said. "They're all quiet," Werner replied. He didn't stop walking. That was the truth that had settled over Army Group Center like a low fog in the weeks since the late spring. The front was quiet, unusually, almost eerily quiet. Soviet artillery, which had thundered without pause for most of the previous winter, had gone nearly silent. Patrol contacts had dropped to almost nothing. The daily reports from reconnaissance flights showed no significant movement on the other side of the line. No large concentrations of armor, no massing of infantry, nothing. At divisional headquarters, there was an attitude Werner recognized and distrusted: satisfaction. The officers there spoke with a confidence he had not heard since 1941. The consensus, repeated at every briefing, was that the Red Army was exhausted. The Soviets had thrown everything into their winter offensives and had spent themselves. They needed months to regroup, to replace their losses, to rebuild their supply chains. The next major blow, when it came, would likely fall further south, toward the oil fields of Romania. Where the strategic stakes were higher. Vitebsk was safe. Army Group Center was stable. Hold the line. Wait. Werner did not believe any of this. He could not have explained exactly why. It was not a single piece of evidence. It was a feeling built from years of watching the Soviet military learn, adapt, and grow. He had fought them when they were poorly coordinated and poorly equipped. He had watched them improve battle by battle, campaign by campaign, until the army pressing against his positions in 1944 bore almost no resemblance to the force that had collapsed in panic in the first weeks of Barbarossa. These were different soldiers now, harder, more patient, more dangerous in ways that went beyond their numbers or their equipment. The silence worried him precisely because it was too complete. In his experience, armies making noise were armies that hadn't yet decided what to do. Armies that had gone silent had already decided. He filed 2 reports in May raising his concerns. Both were acknowledged and dismissed. 600 kilometers to the east, in a command post buried beneath the forest floor near Smolensk, a different kind of silence was being carefully manufactured. Alexei Voronov sat at a folding table covered in maps and worked by the light of a single oil lamp, because electric lights could be seen from the air. Around him, in the underground room that smelled of turned earth and pine, his staff moved quietly. They spoke in low voices. They carried papers and folders rather than calling out across the room. The discipline of concealment had become, after weeks of this operation, as natural as breathing. Voronov was 38 years old. He was a major in the Red Army's artillery planning section, assigned to the 3rd Belarusian Front as a specialist in what Soviet doctrine called the artillery offensive, the systematic destruction of an enemy's defensive network before a single infantryman crossed the line of departure. He was lean, dark-haired, with a kind of focused stillness in his face that some men mistake for calm, and other men, correctly, recognize as controlled intensity. He had been in this war since the first day. Not figuratively, literally. He had been stationed near Brest-Litovsk on the morning of June 22, 1941, when the German barrage began. He had been 25 years old, a junior lieutenant, asleep in a barracks that was hit by artillery fire within the first 15 minutes of the invasion. He had crawled out of the rubble with a torn ear and someone else's blood on his shirt. He had spent the next 4 months in retreat, fighting rearguard actions that delayed the German advance by hours and cost lives he still remembered one by one. He did not speak about 1941 often, but he thought about it constantly, not with bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury he had not been able to afford for 3 years, but with a cold and focused clarity. The date June 22nd meant something specific to him, something that could not be reduced to military doctrine or strategic calculation. It was the date his world had broken open, and when the Soviet High Command, Stavka, had chosen the date for the launch of Operation Bagration, and when Voronov had seen that date written on the planning document, something had moved behind his eyes that was not quite a smile. June 22nd, 1944, 3 years to the day. It was not coincidence. Nothing in Soviet planning at this level was coincidence. He bent over the map again and traced the movement corridors with his finger. 11 armies, more than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 31,000 artillery pieces of all calibers, all of it moving, right now, through the forests and secondary roads of western Russia and eastern Belarus, traveling by night, hidden by day under camouflage nets and fresh-cut branches. The scale of the movement was almost impossible to hold in a single mind. Voronov had spent weeks trying to hold it, and there were still moments when a number appeared in a report. 3,000 guns in this sector alone, or 400,000 shells pre-positioned at this depot. And he had to pause, set down his pencil, and simply acknowledge that what was being assembled here was something outside normal human reckoning. The German intelligence had seen nothing. That was not luck. It was the result of a deception operation of extraordinary sophistication. In the south along the Ukrainian front, Soviet forces were deliberately making noise. Radio traffic, visible troop movements, coordinated small-scale attacks that suggested a major offensive was being prepared in that direction. German reconnaissance, looking for the threat they expected, found exactly what they were meant to find. Meanwhile, in Belarus, the silence that Werner Kast was noting from his watchtower was real. The guns were there, hidden in the pine forests less than 20 kilometers from his position. The tanks were there, parked under camouflage in the river valleys. But they were silent because Voronov and the men around him had made them silent. Every radio transmission from the assault units was routed through a communications protocol that minimized signal traffic. Soldiers were forbidden from lighting fires at night. Supply convoys moved only between midnight and 3 in the morning. When vehicles broke down on the forest roads, they were dragged off the track and covered with netting before first light. Nothing moved in daylight that could be seen from the air. It was, Voronov thought, the most disciplined thing the Red Army had ever done, and it had worked. He stood and walked to the narrow passage that led to the surface, Modern climbing the earthen steps until his head was above ground. He stood for a moment at the edge of the tree line and looked west. The forest was dark. Somewhere beyond it, on the other side of several kilometers of empty ground and minefield and barbed wire, a German officer was looking east at the same darkness. Voronov tried to imagine what that officer was thinking. He had done this many times over many campaigns. He had learned painfully that underestimating the enemy was how you died. German soldiers were skilled. Their commanders were competent. Their defensive positions were carefully engineered. None of that would save them now. He went back underground. In the second week of June, Werner Kast was summoned to a divisional briefing at headquarters in Vitebsk. The room was a large basement space beneath a brick building that had survived 3 years of war largely intact. Maps covered 2 walls. A dozen officers sat around a long table. The division commander, a general Werner had dealt with for 8 months, stood at the head of the table with the particular posture of a man who has decided what he believes and is not interested in hearing otherwise. The briefing covered the standard topics: supply status, trench repair schedules, anticipated patrol activity in the coming weeks. There was a section on what High Command considered the likely direction of the next Soviet offensive, south toward Romania. There was a discussion of reinforcements that were theoretically available and practically nowhere near Vitebsk. There was an update on the Normandy situation, framed in terms that made the Allied landings sound like a manageable complication rather than the second front that everyone in that room understood it to be. Werner waited until the briefing was nearly finished, then spoke. "I want to raise the question of the silence in our sector." Several officers turned to look at him with expressions ranging from mild irritation to polite blankness. "The absence of Soviet activity in the past 3 weeks is not what I would expect from an exhausted army," Werner continued. "An exhausted army reduces its patrol activity gradually. What we are seeing is a complete cessation. In my experience, that pattern corresponds to preparation, not exhaustion." The division commander looked at him for a moment. "Your concerns are noted, Kast. High Command has assessed the intelligence picture. The primary threat is in the south." "I understand that assessment," Werner said. "I'm suggesting it may be wrong." There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality, the quality of a group of people deciding collectively to dismiss what they have just heard. "Your sector will maintain current defensive posture," the general said. "Continue your preparations and your patrol schedule. That will be all." Werner drove back to his position in the back of a staff car, watching the pine forest slide past the windows. The trees were green now, fully leafed in late spring growth. They were beautiful in the indifferent way of all wilderness. Beautiful because they had no opinion about the men passing through them. He thought about what he knew and what he didn't know. He knew the silence was wrong. He knew his superiors would not act on his concerns. He knew that the Festerplatz designation meant that even if Soviet forces appeared on three sides of Vitebsk, his orders would not change. He knew in the bone-deep way that experienced soldiers know things without being able to explain them, that something large and terrible was coming. What he didn't know was when, and he didn't know, could not have known one specific fact that Voronov knew, and that would have changed everything. The date, June 22nd, 3 years to the day. The date had been chosen not just for logistics, not just because the ground would be dry enough for armor, but because the men in the Kremlin understood the weight of symbolic time. They understood that history, when it reverses itself, reverses with greater force when it reverses on the same calendar date. De Werner returned to his watchtower. He read the evening reports. He walked the trench line in the dark. He found Brauer awake at his post when he should have been sleeping, and told him to get rest while he could. "Do you think something's coming, sir?" the young man asked. Werner looked at him for a moment. The boy's face was pale in the darkness, half lit by the distant glow of a cigarette from somewhere down the trench. "Something is always coming," Werner said. "Get some sleep." He meant it as a dismissal. He said it as kindly as he could. The night of June 21st was warm and overcast, the sky a low ceiling of cloud that blocked the stars. Werner could not sleep. When he lay on his cot in the small room he used as quarters, a converted storage space in a farmhouse 300 meters behind the main line, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the night. His pocket watch was on the wooden crate beside the cot. He looked at it every hour. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2. At 2:30 he got up and walked to the main trench. The watchstanders were at their posts. Everything was as it should be. He stood for a while at an observation position, looking through the darkness toward the tree line. Nothing. The same silence. The same absolute, unnatural stillness. He went back to his room. He lay on the cot again. He thought about his wife, Marta, in Hamburg. He thought about his son, who was now 17 and who Werner had not seen in 14 months. Well, he thought about a summer afternoon from before the war, sitting in the garden behind their house while his son chased a dog through the rose beds. The memory was very clear and very distant at the same time. He fell asleep sometime around 3:30. At 4:55 in the morning, the world ended. It did not end slowly. It did not give warning. One moment there was the heavy silence of the pre-dawn, the brief stillness before light, the kind of quiet that had existed on this spot for every morning of the 3 years of occupation. And then, in the space of a single second, the eastern horizon erupted. Werner was thrown from his cot by the concussion before he fully understood he was awake. The windows of the farmhouse vanished in a spray of glass. The walls shook as though something enormous had seized the building and was attempting to tear it apart. He was on the floor, hands over his head, before his mind caught up with his body, before he understood what the sound was. Not one explosion, not 10, but a continuous roar so vast and undifferentiated that it was less like sound and more like a change in the physical state of the air. He got to the door. He pulled it open. The eastern sky, from one horizon to the other, was on fire. Not metaphorically on fire. The flashes of 30,000 artillery pieces firing simultaneously created a light that pulsed and strobed across the underside of the cloud cover, illuminating everything in a hellish pink and orange glow. The ground trembled beneath his boots with a sustained vibration, WWII like standing on the skin of a drum being beaten without pause. The sound was beyond loudness. It was a physical pressure against his chest, against his eardrums, against the bones of his face. And then, beneath the artillery, a new sound began. A metallic screaming that tore through the air in long arcs before shattering into multiple impacts. Katyusha rockets. Dozens of battery salvos firing simultaneously, their trails of fire crossing the dark sky like burning arrows, shot by something infinitely larger than human hands. Werner stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and watched his defensive line disappear. He had been in artillery bombardments before. He had survived the opening barrages of Soviet offensives at Kursk, at Kharkov, in the winter campaigns of 1942 and 1943. When he had learned to assess bombardments the way an engineer assesses structural load. How intense, how concentrated, how sustainable. In every previous bombardment he had experienced, there was a point at which you could distinguish the pattern, could identify the rhythm, could begin to think about what came next. There was no pattern here. There was no rhythm. There was only the continuous, uninterrupted destruction of everything he had spent months building. He ran for the main trench. Men were moving everywhere in the fire-lit darkness, running toward positions or away from positions. Some of them bleeding, some of them still half-dressed, all of them moving through a landscape that was being transformed second by second into a lunar surface of craters and burning timber and collapsed earthworks. He reached the main trench and dropped into it. A young sergeant was crouching against the trench wall, with his hands pressed flat against the earth on either side of him, as though trying to hold it together by force. His eyes were wide. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Werner grabbed his shoulder. "Report. What's your status?" The sergeant's eyes focused. "Position 2 and 3 are hit, sir. Communications to the left flank are down. I don't know about the right flank." "Find out," Werner said. "Move." He continued down the trench. Around him, above him, through every gap in the timber reinforcement, the bombardment continued without pause. In 3 years of war, he had never heard anything like it. Not at Kursk, not at Stalingrad, not at any point in any battle he had been part of. So this was not a bombardment designed to suppress a defensive position. This was a bombardment designed to eliminate one. He reached an intact observation position and looked east. The tree line where he had watched for 3 weeks was gone. In its place was a wall of fire and smoke that stretched across his entire field of vision, illuminated by the constant flashing of guns so numerous that counting them was meaningless. Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the dark shapes of vehicles beginning to move. Tanks, hundreds of them, emerging from the forest with the patient inevitability of something that had been waiting a long time. He looked at his watch. 4:57 in the morning, June 22nd, 1944, and in that moment, with the ground shaking beneath him and the sky on fire and 3 years of carefully maintained defensive line dissolving in the eastern smoke, Werner Kast understood 2 things simultaneously. The first thing he understood was that he had been right. The silence had not been exhaustion, it had been preparation. The largest military operation he had ever seen, the largest he would later understand in the entire history of warfare, had been assembled directly in front of him in perfect silence over a period of months while his superiors reviewed their maps in Vitebsk and spoke with confidence about the South. The second thing he understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with the particular wisdom of a man who had survived 3 years of this war by paying attention, was that the date was not accidental. June 22nd. 3 years ago to the day, he had crossed the Soviet border in a truck full of young officers making bets about Christmas. 3 years ago to the day, he had been on the other side of this equation. The overwhelming force, the rehearsed destruction, the absolute certainty of the attacker. 3 years ago to the day, somewhere on this same landmass, a 25-year-old Soviet lieutenant had crawled out of the rubble of his barracks with a torn ear and someone else's blood on his shirt. Now it was June 22nd again, and the wheel had turned. The bombardment did not stop at dawn. It continued through the morning, shifting and adjusting as Soviet artillery officers corrected their fire based on observation reports, targeting the secondary positions now that the primary defensive line had been reduced to rubble and memory. Werner moved through his sector in a crouch, staying low in the trenches that still existed, crossing open ground in short sprints when the trench network had been destroyed by direct hits. Around him, the landscape of his command, the carefully constructed landscape of 3 years of defensive engineering, was being systematically unmade. Bunker number 4 was gone. A direct hit from a heavy gun had collapsed the roof and buried the crew. Werner found 2 survivors digging with their hands through the broken timber and earth. He helped them pull out a third man who was still breathing but could not speak. The man's eyes were open and moving, tracking Werner's face with a kind of desperate attention, as though Werner's expression might tell him something about his own condition that he was not able to feel. Werner told the 2 survivors to carry him to the aid station 300 meters back. Then he moved on. The communication situation was worse than the physical damage. The telephone cables that connected his battalion to the regiment on his left and right had been cut in multiple places during the first minutes of the bombardment. Radio contact was intermittent. The Soviet artillery had targeted communications infrastructure with precision that told Werner these positions had been identified and mapped weeks or months ago. Someone had been watching, someone had done their homework. By 7 in the morning, he had a partial picture of his sector. It was not a good picture. The forward trench network, the first defensive belt, had been largely destroyed across a 2-kilometer frontage in the center of his position. The concrete bunkers had fared better than the earthworks, but several had been hit, and at least 2 were completely destroyed. His anti-tank gun positions on the right flank had taken direct fire and were no longer reporting. Of the 340 men in his battalion who had begun this morning, he had confirmed contact with fewer than 200. He did not know yet what had happened to the others. In a bombardment like this, absence of contact did not necessarily mean death. Men were separated, disoriented, sheltering in any depression in the ground they could find. The experienced ones would be moving toward rally points, and the less experienced ones would be wherever the last explosion had thrown them, trying to remember what their training had told them to do. He reached his battalion command post, a reinforced dugout that had survived the bombardment with its roof intact and one wall partially collapsed, and found his executive officer, Captain Steiner, bent over a field radio trying to establish contact with the regiment. Steiner looked up when Werner entered. His face was covered in dried blood from a cut above his ear, but his eyes were steady. He was one of the good ones. Werner had known that for 8 months. "Regiment is not responding," Steiner said. "Division came through briefly on the second frequency. They're saying hold position and await further orders. What's the situation on our flanks?" "Left flank is under heavy pressure." "Sure, right flank?" "I don't know. Last report was 20 minutes ago, and it wasn't good." Werner spread his map on the table. He had been marking positions and movements since first light, updating the map with the fragmented information coming in from runners in the occasional radio contact. What the map showed was the beginning of a pattern he had seen before, in other battles, always from the opposite perspective. Pressure on the center to fix the defenders in place, flanking movements to cut communications and supply lines, and then, once the flanks were compromised, the encirclement. He had watched the Red Army do this to Soviet forces in 1941. He had watched it done to German forces at Stalingrad in 1942. He had spent 3 years building a defensive position designed to prevent it from happening here. He looked at the map. He looked at where the Soviet pressure was concentrated and where it was conspicuously absent. He looked at the road network behind his position, the roads that led to Vitebsk and beyond. "Get me division," he said to Steiner, "whatever frequency it takes." 200 kilometers to the south, near the city of Bobruisk, something was happening that the German command had declared impossible. The Berezina River valley south of Bobruisk was dominated by marshland, vast waterlogged expanses of bog and flooded forest that extended for dozens of kilometers in every direction. German engineers had surveyed the area in 1941 and again in 1943, and arrived at the same conclusion both times. The terrain was impassable for mechanized forces. Tanks would sink. Heavy vehicles would lose their tracks in the mud within hours. Any offensive through this ground would be limited to infantry moving at walking pace, easily contained. The German divisions defending the Bobruisk sector had been positioned accordingly. The strongest fortifications faced the direct approach routes, the roads and the higher ground to the north and east. The swamp sectors were held by lighter forces because conventional military wisdom said that lighter forces were sufficient to cover ground that nature itself had already fortified. The conventional military wisdom was wrong. Soviet military engineers had spent 4 months studying the Berezina marshes. They had sent scouts on foot into the deepest sections, men who moved at night and slept in the reeds during the day, mapping every dry ridge, every firm path through the bog, every seasonal variation in the ground's load-bearing capacity. They had calculated weight distributions for T-34 tanks moving in single file across specific routes. They had pre-positioned bridging equipment, fascine bundles for track laying, and engineer units trained specifically in marsh crossing operations. When the attack began on June 22nd, while the German defenders in the Bobruisk sector were focused on the conventional assault coming from the east, Soviet armored columns were already moving through the swamps they had been told were impassable. They moved slowly. They moved carefully. Tanks crossed stretches of bog on temporary corduroy roads, laid by engineers working in chest-deep water in the darkness before dawn. Several vehicles became stuck and had to be abandoned, their crews continuing on foot until they could find the next section of firm ground. The progress was measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, but it was steady, threading through the one terrain feature that the German defensive plan had not defended because defending it had seemed unnecessary. By mid-morning on June 22nd, the lead elements of two Soviet armored brigades had emerged from the western edge of the marshes onto solid ground. Behind the main German defensive line, between the forward positions and the city of Bobruisk itself. The German commanders in the sector received the first reports with frank disbelief. Tanks in the marsh sector was not possible. The reports must be from disoriented men under fire, misidentifying vehicles. Someone needed to confirm. His confirmation came an hour later when a Soviet armored column appeared on a road that, according to every German map and every German assumption, should have been 30 kilometers from the nearest enemy force. The encirclement of Bobruisk had begun. Werner finally reached division headquarters by radio at 9:15 in the morning. The connection was poor, breaking in and out through static, but the message was clear enough. He made his request directly and without preamble. His forward positions were destroyed or compromised across a 2-kilometer frontage. His flanks were under pressure. He was requesting permission to withdraw his battalion to the secondary defensive line, 300 meters to the rear, where prepared positions still existed and where he could consolidate his remaining strength. And the response came back through the static with the flat finality of a message that had been composed at a level far above division headquarters and was simply being relayed downward. Hold position. Vitebsk will be defended. No withdrawals are authorized. Werner set down the radio handset. Steiner was watching him from across the command post. Same answer? Steiner asked. Same answer. He went back to the map. The secondary defensive line was 300 meters behind his current position. In military terms, 300 meters was nothing, a distance that could be covered in minutes under normal conditions. In a fighting withdrawal under artillery fire and Soviet infantry pressure, 300 meters was a different calculation entirely, but it was survivable. His battalion could reach it with acceptable losses if they moved now, while the Soviet infantry assault was still organizing after the bombardment. If they waited another 2 hours, the Soviet infantry would be in the ruins of the forward positions, and a withdrawal across 300 meters of open ground would become something close to suicide. He sent a runner to each of his company commanders with instructions to prepare for a fighting withdrawal on his order. Not to execute, to prepare. He was still operating within his orders. He was simply ensuring that if those orders changed, his battalion could move within minutes rather than hours. Then he went forward again, to the remains of the trench line, to see with his own eyes what was coming. What was coming was everything. Soviet infantry had crossed the destroyed forward positions in the center of his sector and were now moving through the rubble of the first defensive belt, advancing in short bounds, using the craters and destroyed bunkers as cover. Behind them, at the edge of the original tree line, now a burning, shattered remnant of what it had been 4 hours ago. The dark shapes of tanks were visible, moving forward in formation. Machine gun fire was continuous from multiple directions. The Soviet suppression doctrine Werner had learned to respect. Keep the defenders' heads down, maintain fire superiority, never give them a moment to aim. His remaining men were fighting. He could see that clearly. Small groups held positions in the surviving sections of trench, firing back, slowing the advance where they could. An anti-tank gun on the left flank that he had believed destroyed had somehow survived and was firing on the advancing armor. And Werner watched a T-34 take a hit on its left track and slew sideways into a crater, its turret still traversing as it settled into immobility. But for every tank that stopped, 3 more kept coming. He found Brauer in a section of trench near what had been observation position number 2. The boy was firing his rifle methodically, selecting targets and firing with the focused deliberateness that Werner recognized as genuine training overcoming genuine fear. His face was gray with dust, and there was blood on his right hand. A shrapnel cut, Werner assessed, not serious, but his hands were steady on the weapon. Werner crouched beside him. How many rounds do you have? Brower checked without stopping. Cool, 2.5 magazines. Make them count, Werner said. And when I give the order to fall back, you move immediately. You don't hesitate, you move. Brower looked at him quickly, the look of a 20-year-old trying to understand whether the person in front of him knows something he doesn't. Werner held his gaze for just a moment, long enough to communicate what he could not say directly. Then Werner moved on. The order to hold Vitebsk to the last man had come from Adolf Hitler personally. This was not unusual. By the summer of 1944, Hitler's operational control of the Eastern Front had become absolute in a way that no professional military doctrine had ever intended. Sure, the German army, which had spent a century developing a tradition of operational flexibility and decentralized decision-making, had been progressively stripped of its ability to adapt to ground reality by a command structure that elevated ideological determination above tactical competence. The Festerplatz concept, fortified cities to be held regardless of circumstances, was Hitler's strategic answer to a problem that had no good strategic answer. How to hold a front that was too long against an enemy that was too strong, with forces that were too few and too depleted to do what was being asked of them. The logic held that each fortified city that held out forced the Soviets to commit forces to siege operations, slowing their overall advance and buying time for German reserves to be moved into position. The logic had several fatal flaws. It assumed that the Soviet High Command would obligingly stop and besiege each fortified city rather than bypassing it and cutting it off. It assumed that German reserves existed in sufficient strength to exploit the time being bought, and it assumed that the men trapped inside these fortified positions could survive long enough for relief to arrive. None of these assumptions were accurate in June 1944. In Vitebsk, 5 German divisions, approximately 60,000 men, were being compressed into an increasingly small area as Soviet forces advanced around the city's perimeter. The German commanders on the ground sent repeated requests for authorization to withdraw before the encirclement closed completely. Each request was denied. Each denial was received with a mixture of disbelief and a kind of professional grief that Werner, had he been present at headquarters to witness it, would have recognized immediately. At Army Group Center headquarters, there was growing alarm but insufficient authority. The generals could see the map. They could see what was happening to their forces across the entire front, not just at Vitebsk and Bobruisk, but at Orsha, at Mogilev, at a dozen other points along the line. They could see that this was not a local crisis but a systemic collapse, the kind of catastrophic offensive that unraveled entire fronts. They requested permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal to a shorter, more defensible line further west. The request was denied. Hold position, resist, no retreat. Whereas the city of Orsha sat astride the main road connecting Smolensk to Minsk, the highway that had been one of the primary German supply and reinforcement arteries for 3 years. German engineers had spent months transforming the city's surroundings into what many considered the single most heavily fortified position on the entire Belarusian front. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, layered minefields, veteran infantry units who had held this ground through 2 previous Soviet offensive attempts. Voronov had spent 6 weeks studying Orsha. He had studied it the way a surgeon studies anatomy, not looking for what was strong, but looking for what was vulnerable beneath the strength. What the Soviet assault plan for the Orsha sector called for something the German defenders had not anticipated. Simultaneous pressure from 3 directions at once, with the largest concentration of artillery in the sector, focused not on the strongest fortifications but on the communication infrastructure between them. Cut the communication, isolate the bunkers from each other, prevent coordination, then destroy them individually. He was at a forward observation post when the Orsha assault began. A camouflage position on a low ridge with a clear sight line across 3 kilometers of open ground to the city's outer defensive belt. Through his binoculars, he watched the artillery preparation with the analytical attention of a man who has spent years learning to read a battlefield the way others read text. The German positions were expertly constructed. He could see that even from here, the overlapping fields of fire, the depth of the defensive arrangement, the careful positioning of strong points on elevated ground. These were soldiers who knew what they were doing. He had no contempt for them. Contempt was another luxury he could not afford. What they had not anticipated, what no one had anticipated until the Red Army had spent 3 years learning to do it, was the simultaneous application of force at a scale that exceeded the human nervous system's ability to process and respond. When 3,700 artillery pieces opened fire on a 4-kilometer frontage simultaneously, the problem was not any single explosion. The problem was that every decision-making node in the defensive system, every command post, every communications junction, every observation point, was being struck at the same time. The system did not fail at one point. It failed everywhere at once. Voronov watched the German defensive line at Orsha begin to come apart. It took longer than he had expected. That was worth noting, worth respecting. The veteran units holding those positions fought with a ferocity and discipline that slowed the Soviet infantry assault in the first hours. Anti-tank guns that should have been destroyed in the bombardment somehow had not been, and 3 T-34s burned in the approaches, their crews bailing out into ground still under fire. Soviet infantry pinned in the forward assault trenches by surviving machine guns sent back requests for additional artillery support. Voronov granted the requests, the guns adjusted, and the machine gun positions were hit, and the line continued to come apart. By early afternoon, Soviet infantry had penetrated the main defensive belt at 2 points and were expanding the breach in both directions. Tanks moved through the gaps, not fighting their way forward but moving, exploiting the open ground behind the defensive line, while the German units that had held those positions were still engaged to their front and could not turn to face the threat from behind. The road to Minsk was beginning to open. Voronov picked up his radio and reported to the front commander. His words were precise and economical. The words of a man who had learned that in war, as in everything, precision mattered more than volume. Orsha sector main belt breached at 2 points. Armor moving through. A road to Minsk is accessible. The response was a single word. Continue, he continued. Werner made his decision at 2 in the afternoon. He had spent the morning fighting a defensive action that he had known, from approximately 9 o'clock, was not going to succeed. His battalion had held the secondary line after an unauthorized retrograde movement that he had ordered on his own authority, without divisional approval, at 11:30. A decision made with the full knowledge that it would likely result in a court-martial if he survived. He had ordered it because the alternative was the destruction of his battalion in the ruins of a forward position that had already been bypassed on both flanks. Even from the secondary line, it was clear by early afternoon that the situation was beyond tactical recovery. Soviet forces had penetrated the main defensive belt on either side of his position. The regiment on his left had effectively ceased to exist as an organized unit. He had received one fragmentary radio message from them at noon, then nothing. On his right, isolated groups were falling back toward the city in disorder, without coordination. More critically, a runner had arrived at 1:15 with information that Werner had been dreading and half expecting since morning. Soviet armored units had been identified on the Polotsk Road, a road that lay north of Vitebsk, a road that should have been secure, a road that was supposed to be 30 kilometers from the nearest enemy position. Werner looked at his map. He looked at the Polotsk Road to the north. He looked at the road south of the city. He looked at the road east. He was a lieutenant colonel with 3 years of experience on the Eastern Front. He did not need a general to explain what 3 Soviet armored columns appearing simultaneously to the north, south, and east of a city meant. Vitebsk was being surrounded, not threatened, not pressured, surrounded. The encirclement was not complete yet. There were still routes open, still roads that had not yet been cut. But those routes would be closed within hours. The Soviet operational tempo he had been watching all day, the speed of the armored advances, the depth of the penetrations, the systematic cutting of communications, was moving faster than anything in his 3 years of combat experience. These were not soldiers feeling their way forward. And these were soldiers executing a plan that had been rehearsed and prepared to a degree of precision he was only now beginning to fully understand. He called Steiner to the command post. "I need an honest answer," Werner said. "How many combat-effective men do we have?" Steiner's answer was precise. That was one of the things Werner valued about him. Approximately 180. Perhaps 30% of those are carrying wounds that will affect their performance under sustained combat. 180 men, out of 340 that had begun the morning. Werner looked at his map for a long time. He thought about the Festerplatz order. He thought about the runners he had sent to division, the radio calls, the chain of requests that had been denied at every level with the same inflexible response. And he thought about the 5 divisions being compressed into Vitebsk, 60,000 soldiers who were about to be trapped inside a city that was being surrounded by a force that had already demonstrated that very morning what it was capable of. He thought about Brauer, who was somewhere in the secondary line with 2 magazines and a half and a shrapnel cut on his right hand. He picked up the radio handset. "Get me division, whatever it takes." It took 11 minutes. When the connection came through, Werner spoke without preamble. "This is Cast. I am reporting that the encirclement of Vitebsk is in progress. Soviet armored elements have been confirmed on the Polotsk road to the north. Southern approach roads are under threat. I am requesting immediate authorization to withdraw my battalion westward while routes remain open. I am also formally recommending the division request authorization for a general withdrawal of all units from Vitebsk before the encirclement is complete. We have perhaps 6 to 8 hours. The response took 40 seconds. Hold position. Vitebsk will be defended to the last. No withdrawals are authorized." Werner set down the handset. He sat very still for a moment. Outside the command post, the sounds of battle were continuous. Artillery, machine guns, the particular metallic crash of tank main guns firing at close range. The secondary line was holding, but it would not hold indefinitely, and it did not matter whether it held because the battle that mattered was not being fought in front of his position. It was being fought 30 kilometers to the north and south, where Soviet armor was closing the ring. He looked at Steiner. "Now, they're not going to authorize a withdrawal," he said. Steiner said nothing. He had known this since morning. Werner stood. He took his coat from the hook on the wall. He walked to his map table, and he stood over it for a long time, looking at the city, at the roads, at the 5 German divisions being sealed inside what would become their tomb. Then he picked up the map, folded it once, and set it on the edge of the table. He looked at Steiner. "Burn the operational documents," and he said, "everything that identifies unit positions. I don't want it falling into Soviet hands if they hit this post." Steiner moved to comply. As he fed the first sheaf of papers into the small iron stove in the corner of the command post, Werner watched the flames take them. And the maps and reports that represented months of his work curled and blackened and became nothing. He watched until they were gone. Then he picked up his coat. "I'm going to the forward position," he said. "I need to see the ground." What he needed, in truth, was to think. And he had always thought more clearly when he was moving. He found Brauer at the edge of the secondary line, near a section of intact trench that offered a view across the open ground to the east. The boy was not firing now. There was nothing to fire at in this particular sector. The Soviet pressure had shifted left, toward a section of line where Werner could hear sustained combat. Here, for the moment, there was a brief interval between one wave and the next. Brauer looked up when Werner crouched beside him. His face was very tired. "What's happening?" "Sir?" he asked, not asking for tactical information, asking the deeper question. Werner looked east. The smoke was everywhere now, a gray-brown haze that obscured the middle distance, lit from below by fires that burned without pause. Through the smoke, barely visible, he could see movement. Soviet infantry consolidating positions, tanks moving in the deeper ground behind the forward elements. He thought about what he knew. He thought about what his orders said. He thought about 60,000 men inside a city that was being surrounded right now, at this moment, while he crouched in a trench with a 20-year-old boy who wrote letters to his mother every week. He stood. He went back to the command post. He found Steiner, who was closing the door of the now empty stove. "We're moving," Werner said. "Tonight, after dark, west. Well, we are not going into Vitebsk." Steiner looked at him carefully. "That's a direct violation of orders." "Yes," Werner said. "If we survive, there will be consequences." "Yes," Werner said again. "Gather the company commanders. We move at 2200. There was a silence between them, a long one. The kind of silence that contains a decision that cannot be unmade. What about the other units in the sector? Steiner asked quietly. The question was not accusatory. It was the question of a careful man acknowledging the full weight of what was being decided. Werner looked at his map. Around Vitebsk, 5 German divisions, 60,000 men. Men who were receiving the same orders he was receiving. Men whose commanders were being told right now the same thing he had been told. Hold position, no withdrawal, defend to the last. Henry, he looked at that number on the map for a very long time. I can't order other commanders, he said finally. I can only order mine. He said it quietly. He said it in the tone of a man who is stating a military fact and knows simultaneously that it is the least adequate thing he has ever said. He would say it again, to himself, thousands of times in the years that followed, in the darkness of a prison camp, in the silence of a Hamburg apartment after the war, lying awake at 3 in the morning while his wife slept beside him. I can only order mine. 163 men moved out of their positions at 10 in the evening. Not the 180 Steiner had counted earlier in the day, because 17 more had become casualties in the afternoon fighting. They moved west along secondary tracks through the forest, out away from Vitebsk, away from the encirclement that was closing around 60,000 of their countrymen. Werner walked at the front of the column. He did not look back. Behind him, inside the ring that was closing around Vitebsk, the guns fired without pause through the night. And in that city, in those trenches and bunkers and ruins, the men who had received the same orders he had received and followed them, settled in to wait for reinforcements that would never come, for a relief force that did not exist, for an outcome that the map had already decided. The forest at night was a different kind of darkness, not the darkness of the open steppe, where at least the sky gave you stars in distance. This was the close darkness of the Belarusian pine forest, pressing in from every side, and the trees so dense that Werner could rarely see more than 10 meters in any direction. The column moved in single file, each man keeping contact with the soldier ahead by sound more than sight. The soft crunch of boots on needle-covered ground, the only reliable indicator that the man in front was still there. Werner had positioned Steiner at the rear of the column. Between them, 161 men moved through the dark forest in near total silence. 2 had been separated during the initial movement out of the trench line, lost in the confusion of getting 160 men moving quietly through a combat zone in darkness. He had waited 15 minutes for them at the first rally point. They had not appeared. He had moved on. They had been moving for 3 hours when they heard the tanks. The sound came from the north, a low mechanical rumbling that Werner identified immediately and that caused him to raise his right hand, the column stopping in sequence behind him within seconds, every man going still with the trained instinct of soldiers who understood what that sound meant. He stood motionless, listening, trying to locate the direction and distance with precision. The tanks were moving on the road that ran parallel to their route, perhaps half a kilometer to the north. Moving west. Soviet armor, cutting along the road network to complete the encirclement, operating through the night because speed was more important than caution when you were closing a trap around 60,000 men. Werner waited. The sound grew louder, then plateaued, and then began slowly to diminish as the column passed their position and continued west. He waited an additional 10 minutes after the last sound faded before he signaled the column to move again. They crossed the road the tanks had used 40 minutes later, moving quickly across the open ground in groups of 5, Werner watching both directions while the men crossed. The road surface showed the fresh track marks of heavy vehicles, pressed deep into the summer mud at the road's edge. He counted the track widths as the men passed. 3 distinct vehicle types, a substantial force. They were behind the encirclement now. The question was how far. By dawn, they had covered roughly 18 kilometers, and Werner called a halt in a dense section of forest well back from any road. He set a perimeter and allowed the men to rest in shifts while he and Steiner assessed what they had. 147 men had reached this first resting point. 14 had become separated in the darkness of the crossing, lost at the road or in the forest beyond it. Werner marked them in his notebook and moved on. There was nothing else he could do. He had a compass, his personal map, and a general knowledge of the road network from months of studying the terrain. His plan was simple: continue west, moving only at night, avoiding all main roads, using the forests and secondary tracks that crisscrossed rural Belarus in a network that appeared on his map as thin lines, but on the ground varied between passable paths and nearly impenetrable undergrowth. They needed to travel roughly 150 kilometers to reach what he estimated might still be a German line of some kind near the Polish border, if a German line still existed at all, which he was no longer certain of. He did not share these calculations with the men. What the men needed was movement and purpose, not arithmetic about distances and probabilities. They moved for 6 nights, resting through each day in the deepest forest they could find. The daytime halts were the hardest part of every cycle. Men who had been fighting since before dawn on June 22nd were drawing on a reserve of physical endurance with a finite limit, and that limit was somewhere close. Hunger was constant. They had taken what rations they could carry when they moved out. But feeding 140 men from infantry packs across multiple days was not sustainable. They found water from small streams and forest pools, which Werner treated from his dwindling supply of purification tablets. For food, the Belarusian midsummer forest occasionally offered something: berries, mushrooms that Steiner identified with the cautious confidence of a man who had grown up foraging and understood the difference between edible and fatal. It was not enough. It was better than nothing. The column shrank as the nights passed. On the second night, a group of 11 men took a wrong turn at a forest junction and did not return to the column before Werner reached the next scheduled halt point. He waited the prescribed time, 30 minutes, as he had briefed the company commanders, and moved on. So he recorded the names and told himself that they might find another route through. On the third night, Werner took the column within what he estimated was 200 meters of a Soviet field encampment, close enough to smell cooking fires and hear occasional voices drifting through the trees. He took the column wide around it through 2 hours of near-silent movement, through undergrowth so thick that men had to pass their weapons forward hand to hand to push through the branches. No one spoke. Several men were cut across the face and hands by branches they could not see in the darkness. No one made a sound about it. On the fourth night, 4 men did not appear at a rest point. Werner believed they had made a private decision: to surrender, to try alone, to simply stop. He did not judge this. Every man in this forest had been awake and under fire for the better part of 10 days. The will to continue walking west in the dark was not an unlimited resource. He recorded the names and moved on. The separations continued in this way, a slow arithmetic of loss that reduced the column by ones and twos and occasional larger groups across 6 nights, until Werner counted 61 men around him in the forest on the morning of July 10th. Steiner was still there, steady, precise, saying only what needed to be said. He organized the rest schedules without being asked. He managed the distribution of whatever food existed without complaint or favoritism. When exhaustion came closest to fragmenting the group, when men sat down at a rest point and simply did not get up when Werner signaled the column to move, it was Steiner's voice, a quiet and non-negotiable, that moved them. Werner had come to rely on his presence in a way that went beyond rank or function. On the evening of July 10th, Werner estimated they were somewhere west of the Shara River, a position consistent with having traveled approximately 150 kilometers from Vitebsk across 6 nights of movement. He believed they were within 1 or 2 nights of reaching whatever remained of the German lines. He based this on the artillery sounds to the west, which for the past 2 nights had been moving further away rather than closer, suggesting a front of some kind was still being contested ahead, rather than a complete Soviet advance to the Polish border. He was roughly correct in this estimate. He simply did not yet know what he would find when he arrived. On the afternoon of July 11th, the forest changed. Werner had halted the column for a rest period. Most of the men were sitting or lying among the trees, a few sleeping, most simply existing in the kind of stripped-down present-tense awareness that extreme exhaustion produces. He was at the front of the resting column, studying his map, when he became aware that the quality of the forest's attention had shifted. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive for 3 years. Not a sound, not a movement. A change in the texture of the silence. The difference between a forest that is simply empty and a forest that is watching. He raised his right hand without looking up from the map. The column went still. He looked at the trees around him. They came out of the forest from three sides simultaneously, perhaps 30 men and two women, armed with a mixture of Soviet military weapons and civilian hunting rifles and implements that Werner could not immediately identify as weapons but clearly were. They wore no uniforms. They wore the clothes of farmers and woodcutters and people who had been living in forests for a long time. Their faces were the faces of people who had seen what 3 years of German occupation looked like from the inside. Werner did not reach for his weapon. He made this decision in the half-second between seeing them emerge and the moment when the choice would have become irrelevant. He kept his hands visible and stood still. Behind him, he heard the sounds of his men reacting, the click of weapons being raised, the sharp intake of breath of soldiers confronting something unexpected. He spoke without turning his head. "Put your weapons down," he said. "All of them, carefully." There was a silence behind him that contained everything. The military training, the instinct, the 3 years of conditioning that said a soldier does not disarm in the field, does not surrender while he still has ammunition and ground under his feet. He heard Steiner's voice, quiet and firm, from somewhere toward the rear. "You heard him! Down!" The sounds of rifles being set on the ground came one by one. Werner counted them. When the last one was down, he set his own pistol on the needle-covered ground in front of his feet and straightened up. The partisan who appeared to be in charge was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a gray beard and the large, work-hardened hands of someone who had spent his life doing physical labor. He looked at Werner with an expression that contained many things. None of them warm, most of them earned over 3 years of living under occupation. Werner looked back at him directly without looking away. He had surrendered to preserve 61 lives. That was the military logic, and it was sound. 61 men with dwindling ammunition, exhausted and disoriented, in forests they didn't fully know, against 30 partisans who knew this ground the way they knew their own houses. The arithmetic was clear, but standing there in the late afternoon light, Werner understood with a clarity that bypassed argument that the arithmetic was not the whole truth of this moment. He had been in Belarus since 1941. He had held a sector of the front that was part of an occupation. He had not personally committed the acts he knew had been committed in this country under the German presence. He had been a soldier holding a defensive line, not a man who had participated in the organized destruction of the civilian population. He knew the difference, and it mattered to him. But standing in front of this gray-bearded man, whose country had been occupied for 3 years, Werner understood that the difference, while real, was insufficient. He had been part of the same structure. His uniform was part of the same thing that had produced whatever this man had witnessed, whatever he had lost, whoever he was mourning in the silence behind his eyes. Werner raised his hands, because this was where history had brought them both, this clearing, this light, this particular evening in July 1944. The wheel that had been turning since June 22, 1941, the wheel that Werner had watched reverse itself on the morning of June 22, 1944, standing in a farmhouse doorway with the eastern horizon on fire, had brought him here and presented him with a reckoning he could not argue with. He was on the wrong side of it. He had been on the wrong side for 3 years. The fact that he had not chosen it in the way a man chooses the things he truly believes in did not change which side it was. He raised his hands. He looked the gray-bearded man in the eye, and he waited. The official count, when the accounting was finally done, was staggering. Operation Bagration had not weakened Army Group Center. It had destroyed it. Russia, in the space of less than 6 weeks, from June 22 to mid-August 1944, the most powerful German military formation on the Eastern Front had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The numbers attached to this destruction were of a scale that strained comprehension. More than 400,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. 28 divisions were completely annihilated, their unit flags removed from the German order of battle, their replacements still months away from formation. 17 general officers were captured. The equipment losses were staggering. Thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks, an incalculable quantity of the trucks and supply infrastructure that kept a modern army functioning. By comparison, the Allied landings at Normandy on June 6th, which had dominated Western headlines and Western memory, resulted in German casualties of perhaps 80,000 men in the same period. Bagration was 5 times larger. It unfolded on a front 3 times as wide. It advanced 3 times as far. Almost nobody in the West knew about it. The deception that Voronov had helped construct, the false signals, the masked movements, the carefully manufactured silence, had worked so completely that Western journalists and military observers had barely covered the operation in its early stages. By the time the scale of the catastrophe became impossible to ignore, the narrative of the war in the West had already been fixed around Normandy, around the breakout through France, around the race to the Rhine. And Bagration existed at the edge of Western awareness, a vast shadow event that had happened simultaneously with the more photographed, more reported war in the West. This asymmetry of memory is worth pausing on. The Normandy landings were a genuine turning point. Brave men on a defended beach, a logistical achievement of remarkable scale, the opening of a Western front that Hitler had long dreaded. None of that is diminished by Bagration. But when Americans think of the summer of 1944, they think of Normandy. Very few think of Belarus, of the forests and swamps where the largest military operation in human history was simultaneously grinding the German army's most powerful formation into dust. The public knowledge, the popular memory, the cultural weight of the two operations diverged immediately in 1944 and has never fully converged. What Bagration remained in the West, the war's great forgotten battle, known to military historians, invisible to almost everyone else. The Minsk pocket had closed completely on July 3rd. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers had been compressed into an area that shrank with each passing day as Soviet forces advanced from every direction. The men inside were the remnants of divisions that had held the Belarusian front for years, units that had survived Barbarossa, Stalingrad, the winter campaigns, the endless attritional fighting of 1943. Experienced soldiers, soldiers who had learned to survive in conditions that would have broken less hardened men. Now they were learning the limits of hardness. Supply failed completely within the first days after encirclement. No food, no ammunition resupply, no fuel. What the men inside the pocket carried on their persons and in their vehicles was what existed. When it was gone, it was gone. By the third day, some units were rationing ammunition to single-digit rounds per man. By the fifth day, men were fighting with whatever they could find. Weapons recovered from the dead, vehicles stripped of fuel, food taken from farmhouses that had already been emptied. Soviet attack aircraft operated in continuous rotation over the pocket, targeting any movement larger than a small group of men on foot. The roads inside became graveyards. Trucks, tanks, horse-drawn supply wagons, ambulances. Entire columns attempting to move by day were destroyed from the air within minutes. Movement became nocturnal and furtive, small groups slipping through forests, hoping to find a gap in a Soviet perimeter that grew smaller each night. There were no gaps. The perimeter was held. Inside the pocket, the final days had their own terrible rhythm. German units that still existed as organized formations attempted breakout attacks. Massed infantry charges down roads that led into solid Soviet defensive lines, supported by whatever armor had not yet run dry of fuel. Some of these attacks achieved initial penetrations. Men broke through the first Soviet line and ran, literally ran, toward what they hoped was open ground beyond. In almost every case, a second Soviet line was waiting. The men who reached it were stopped. The men who reached it and were not stopped found a third line further on. The forests inside the pocket filled with soldiers who had abandoned any pretense of organized military action and were simply trying to survive, moving by night, hiding by day, eating whatever the Belarusian summer provided, and hoping that the next darkness would bring them closer to something that was not yet over. Soviet patrols moved through those same forests with increasing density, and the partisan units that had been operating behind German lines for years moved with them, intimately familiar with every track and clearing. The roads told the story most plainly. Kilometers of German vehicles stood destroyed or abandoned on every route that led west. Trucks with their engines cold, tanks with their hatches open and their fuel gauges on empty, supply wagons with their horses dead in the traces. Personal equipment lay scattered across the verges. Helmets, photographs, letters, boots. The artifacts of lives interrupted at a specific moment and left where they fell. By the time organized resistance ended, the arithmetic of the pocket had resolved itself in the most brutal possible way. Of the roughly 100,000 men trapped inside, the majority would not walk out under their own power. Voronov entered Minsk on the morning of July 3rd. He rode in the back of a staff car moving slowly along a road crowded with Soviet vehicles. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, all moving west with the steady momentum of an army that had not stopped in 11 days. On either side, the landscape showed the layered destruction of 3 years of German occupation, followed by 11 days of the most intensive offensive operation in the history of the war. He had expected, in the years of fighting that had preceded this moment, to feel something specific when he reached Minsk. He had thought about this city for months, had studied it on maps, had traced the roads leading to it with his finger hundreds of times, had written the words Minsk sector in hundreds of planning documents. It was the objective, the central point, the hub around which the entire operational design had been built. What he felt, entering it, was harder to name. The city was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Block after block of burned buildings, collapsed walls, streets filled with rubble that had been roughly cleared by bulldozers to allow military traffic to pass. Civilians were beginning to emerge from wherever they had sheltered during the final days of fighting. Thin, hollow-faced people who stood at the edges of the road and watched the Soviet column pass, with expressions that Voronov found difficult to read. Not joy exactly, something more tentative, something that had been suppressed for 3 years and was only now carefully beginning to remember itself. He had seen liberated cities before. He had seen what 3 years of German occupation meant for the people who had lived through it. The systematic destruction, the deportations, the organized starvation of populations the occupiers had decided were expendable. He knew the numbers, or some of the numbers. Nobody knew all of them yet. The actual count of what had happened in Belarus under German occupation would take years to establish, and the final figure, when it came, would be incomprehensible in the way that only very large numbers about very final things can be incomprehensible. He did not look away from the faces of the civilians lining the road. He made himself look at each one directly, for as long as his moving vehicle allowed. He did not know why he did this. It seemed important. His driver, a young sergeant from Georgia who had been with him since the previous winter, said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "We did it." "Yes," Voronov said. He said nothing more. He went back to his maps. The war was not over. The road to Berlin was open, but Berlin was still a long way away. And the road between here and there was still going to cost what it was going to cost. He picked up his pencil and began working. In Moscow, in August of 1944, a different kind of reckoning was arranged. 57,000 German prisoners of war were marched through the streets of Moscow. They walked for hours, a column that stretched for kilometers, escorted by Soviet military police, and watched by hundreds of thousands of Moscow civilians who lined the streets in near total silence. These were not cheering crowds. They were people who had lost someone, who had lost, in many cases, several someones, and who watched the column pass with expressions that contained too many things to be reduced to a single emotion. After the prisoners had passed, street cleaning trucks followed their route, each washing the pavement, a deliberate and unmistakable statement about what the Soviet government thought of what had walked there. Voronov was not in Moscow that day. He was still in Belarus, still working, still moving the front westward with the methodical precision that had characterized everything he had done since the planning began in the underground room near Smolensk. But he read the reports of the march, and he thought about it for a long time. Of 57,000 men walking through a city, he had helped put them there. The number was real. The faces were real, though he had not seen them. The silence of the watching crowd was real in a way that no victory proclamation had ever managed to be. American military observers watched the march. They took notes. Some of them were men who had spent years studying Soviet operational methods, writing reports that sat in drawers in the War Department and would be pulled out in the years to come. As the Cold War began, and the question of how to fight a large land war against a sophisticated opponent became suddenly, urgently relevant. Those reports would be read, studied, debated, refined, and eventually incorporated into the doctrine that the United States Army would spend the 1970s and 1980s developing. The doctrine was called air-land battle. It held that the way to defeat a numerically superior enemy was through deep strikes on rear areas, simultaneous pressure at multiple points along a broad front, disruption of command and control before the main attack, and the kind of encircling maneuver that cut the enemy off from supply and reinforcement while destroying his ability to coordinate a response. It was, in its essential architecture, a doctrine of overwhelming and simultaneous force applied at a scale the enemy's nervous system could not process. It was, in its essential architecture, what Voronov had helped plan in the forests of Belarus in the spring of 1944. In August of 1990, when Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and American generals began planning the campaign to remove them, the doctrine they reached for was air-land battle. The plan they developed, deep flanking movement through the desert, simultaneous attacks along the entire front, disruption of Iraqi command and control before the ground assault began, a left hook that swept around the Iraqi defenses and enclosed them from behind, bore a direct structural resemblance to the operational design of Bagration. The ground campaign lasted 100 hours. The men who fought it, American soldiers and Marines in their 30s and 40s in 1991, many of them now in their 60s and 70s, many of them the exact men who might be watching this right now, had executed a doctrine whose intellectual roots ran through a long chain of study and adaptation and refinement back to the forests of Belarus and the summer of 1944. They had trained for it in Germany during the Cold War years, running exercises in the Fulda Gap against a hypothetical Soviet opponent who would use precisely the methods that Voronov had helped pioneer. And they had practiced it in the desert training ranges of the American Southwest, where unit after unit ran through the choreography of deep flanking attacks and simultaneous multi-axis pressure. They had refined it through the 1980s in the classrooms of Fort Leavenworth and the lecture halls of the Army War College, where military historians and operational planners had spent years studying the Eastern Front with the seriousness it deserved. When the ground war began on February 24, 1991, the 7th Corps swept left through the Saudi desert and drove deep into Iraq, cutting off the Republican Guard formations from behind before they could react or retreat. The 18th Airborne Corps moved simultaneously on a parallel axis further west, extending the envelopment. Marine forces held the Iraqi attention to the south and east. The Iraqi command, when unable to process simultaneous pressure from multiple directions and unable to communicate coherently because coalition air power had spent weeks destroying their communications infrastructure, had no effective response. The whole thing had an architectural familiarity to anyone who had studied Bagration. They had won their war using, in part, a method born from this one, born from a battle that most of them had never heard of, planned by a Soviet major working by lamplight in an underground room in the forests of a country that most Americans could not have placed on a map. Werner Kass spent 4 years in Soviet prisoner of war camps. He was not treated well, but he survived, which was more than could be said for a significant percentage of the German soldiers who entered Soviet captivity in the summer of 1944. He spent the first year in a camp in the Urals, the second and third years near Magnitogorsk, the fourth year outside Moscow in a camp used for prisoners being processed for repatriation. He returned to Hamburg in the spring of 1949. His wife Marta was there. His son was 22 years old and did not recognize him immediately at the train station, then did, and the moment of recognition, the precise second when his son's face changed, was something Werner carried for the rest of his life as the most complete thing he had ever witnessed. He found work in construction. Hamburg was rebuilding, which meant there was always work for a man who could direct other men and who understood how to read terrain and establish priorities. He was good at it. Patient and systematic, he did not make promises he could not keep. He never wrote a memoir. He never spoke publicly about the war. Captain Steiner had survived the prisoner camps as well. They had been separated shortly after capture and not reunited until a chance encounter at the Repatriation Processing Center outside Moscow in the winter of 1948. They had shaken hands and stood together for a moment without speaking, which was all that needed to happen. Steiner returned to Frankfurt, found work as an accountant, and he and Werner exchanged letters twice a year for the rest of their lives. The letters were not about the war. They were about their families, their work, the ordinary texture of lives rebuilt from the rubble of a decision made in a command post in Belarus in June 1944. What Werner thought about in the quiet hours, Mosh was not the large decisions, the ones that appeared in historical records as unit movements and command choices. It was the small ones. The moment in the command post when he had watched the operational maps burn, the moment in the trench with Brower, the moment in the forest when he had set his pistol on the ground and raised his hands. He thought about Brower most often, the boy from Saxony who wrote letters to his mother every week, who had cleaned his rifle in the trench with the focused deliberateness of someone trying to be worthy of the training he had been given. Werner had not seen him after the night the column moved west. In the darkness and confusion of the forest crossing, the column had fragmented and reassembled, and when Werner had counted his men at the first rest point before dawn on June 23rd, Brower had not been among them. Werner did not know what had happened to him. He had tried after the war through every channel that existed for such searches, the Red Cross tracing services, the German War Graves Commission, the prisoner of war records that were slowly being made available through diplomatic negotiations across the decade following the armistice. He had found nothing definitive. A private from Saxony, 20 years old in the summer of 1944, had passed through the record-keeping systems of the war and left no clear trace on the other side. He might have been captured in the forest that first night, separated from the column in the darkness and taken by a Soviet patrol. He might have been killed, a shot in the dark, a moment Werner would not have known about until the count came up short at dawn. He might, one of Werner sometimes allowed himself to think, have made it through on a different route entirely, found another path west, attached himself to a different unit, fought somewhere else in the final year of the war, and come home to Saxony and his mother and a life that Werner would never hear about. The absence of a record was not the same as evidence of death, but after years of searching, absence of a record was all Werner had, and it was all he would ever have. He had told Brower, the last time he saw him, "When I give the order to fall back, you move immediately. You don't hesitate." He had said it in the trench on the afternoon of June 22nd as a small act of care, giving the boy advance notice, a moment of mental preparation before the order came. He had not known saying it that it was the last thing he would ever say to him. He had not known walking away from that section of trench that the next time he would think about those words, he would be sitting at a kitchen table in Hamburg 40 years later, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, unable to remember with certainty whether Brower had nodded in response or simply looked at him with those young, exhausted eyes. Werner thought about the 60,000 men inside Vitebsk. He knew what had happened to them. It was history now, documented in books available in any library. He knew the number of survivors, which was small. He knew what had become of those who had not survived, which was the larger number. He knew what his decision had cost. He also knew what it had saved. He held both of these things simultaneously for the rest of his life. Not in balance. They did not balance. Anno could not balance. The arithmetic did not work that way, but simultaneously, side by side in the same mind, belonging to the same man, inseparable from each other, part of the same irreducible truth of what had happened in Belarus in the summer of 1944. Alexei Voronov did not talk about Bagration with his children. He had two daughters born in 1947 and 1950. They grew up knowing their father had served in the war. Everyone's father had served in the war. And knowing that he had been involved in something important because there were mentions in official documents and a medal that lived in a wooden box in the bedroom drawer. But he did not tell them stories. He did not describe the planning sessions in the underground command post, the columns moving without lights through the forest, on the morning when 30,000 guns opened fire and the eastern sky became one continuous flame. He kept working in the military, rising to colonel before retiring in 1962. He taught at a staff academy for several years after that, where his reputation among students was for precision and for a quality of seriousness that some found intimidating and others found clarifying. He graded planning exercises with the same analytical attention he had brought to the Orsha sector maps in the spring of 1944. He told his students that the difference between a good plan and a plan that worked was the distance between what you assumed and what you actually knew. He retired to a small apartment in Leningrad. He read. He went to the Hermitage on Tuesdays when it was less crowded. Now he corresponded with two former colleagues who had worked on the Bagration planning staff. The letters were not about Bagration. They were about their families, their health, the books they were reading, the way the city changed and did not change across the decades. He died in 1987, 2 years before the Soviet Union began the long process of ceasing to exist. The forests of Belarus are quiet now. The trenches have been reclaimed by the earth, filled in by decades of rain, covered by the advance of tree roots and moss, reduced to slight depressions in the ground that catch the eye of someone who knows what to look for, but mean nothing to someone who doesn't. The ground still gives up metal, shell casings, buttons, fragments of equipment, when a farmer turns a deep furrow or a construction crew breaks earth for a new foundation. But the larger objects were cleared in the years after the war. The small things persist. They always do. In Vitebsk, there is a memorial. In Minsk, there are several. The Belarusian people, who lost a proportion of their population in the Second World War that is difficult to communicate in words. 1 in 4, by conservative estimates, 1 in 3 by others, have not forgotten what happened here. They remember it in ways that remain personal and immediate, passed from grandparents to parents to children in the specific way that catastrophic events are transmitted through families. Not as history, but as something that happened to us, to people whose names we know, in a place we can drive to on a Sunday afternoon and stand in the silence and try to understand. The date June 22nd still means something specific in Belarus and in Russia, who it means the beginning, and Bagration means the turning. And between those two dates, there are 3 years of suffering on a scale that has very few comparisons in the human record. But the story does not end with the memorial. It extends forward through all the ways military knowledge travels, through doctrine and teaching and the patient study of what worked and why. It extends to desert roads and the thunder of armored columns and the particular application of coordinated force that ended a different war in a different place in 100 hours. It extends to the men who fought that desert war, men who are older now, much older, who remember what it felt like to be part of something that moved with overwhelming, coordinated force, that hit everywhere at once and left an enemy no time to think and no room to respond. They did not know, most of them, where it came from. In the spring of 1944, in the forests and rivers and ruined cities of Belarus, 2 men stood on opposite sides of the same darkness and looked toward each other without knowing it. One of them was building his 3rd year of faith in a defensive line he had known, in the deepest part of himself, was not going to hold. The other was counting guns hidden in the trees, guns that represented 3 years of his own life rebuilt from rubble into something harder and more patient and more precise than he had been on the morning the barracks fell on him. Both of them were doing what the war had made of them. Both of them were about to find out what the war had finally decided. The silence before the storm was the last quiet thing either of them would know for a very long time. What came after changed everything. Not just the front, not just the war, the way armies think about force, the way generals plan and commanders decide, and soldiers move through dark terrain toward objectives that will take years to fully understand. All of it changed. All of it flows in part from what happened here, in this particular ground, in this particular summer, between men who have been dead for decades and whose names most of the world has never heard. In the forest where Werner Kast once stood at his watch tower and tried to read the silence. In the underground rooms where Alexei Voronov worked by lamplight and counted guns no enemy could see. In the ground that still holds, 80 years later, the small metal remnants of the largest military operation ever conducted. An operation that most of the world still does not know by name. Operation Bagration. The storm they never saw coming. The battle that broke the German army's back and opened the road to Berlin, and whose echo, carried forward through decades of doctrine and study and 100 hours of desert war, reaches all the way to the men watching this right now. The wheel of history turns. It does not announce itself. It builds in silence, in the dark, beyond what anyone watching from the other side can see. And then it arrives all at once, with a force that no defensive line, however carefully constructed, however stubbornly held, can long withstand. Werner Kast learned that on the morning of June 22, 1944, Anna standing in a farmhouse doorway with the eastern sky on fire and 3 years of careful preparation dissolving in the smoke. He never forgot it. Neither should we.